And welcome to the Life Burst Podcast. So, just a quick review. I probably have thrown this tier list up on a different video that's probably aired before this one, but this is the current tier list that I think that we're going with Wixoss moving forward into this next set. I'll move these things and adjust as needed, and then update later down the line in the set. But for now, this is where I think things are going to fall. The things in blue are the new things. I won't get too into it because I'll leave that for its own video if that has not aired yet or not. But I think this is where things will basically end up in. Let me just X out of here, and we're going to do the best of the rest now. Yes, it's the segment that we always do, where I take the decks that are sort of tier C and above, although it's getting a little hard to manage this many from C and above. Wixoss has a wide variety of decks that all are pretty good to use. So I update basically all the ones that are like pretty optimal and can win you a tournament. And I update them all one by one, and I go through all of them. This time around, we've got like 15. So here's what we're going to do for this one. Normally, I go into each of them pretty individually, and I talk about all the cards in them and do a refresher of the deck. This time, I'm going to skip that. I'm going to do a couple sentences here on like what is the purpose of this deck, why would you use this deck, and then also what changes have been added to this deck from the last time around, rather than going over how the entire deck functions. If you guys want to see how the deck functions, check the playlists on the side here on my videos. You'll find the videos where these deck lists originate from, and we talk about sort of like why they exist, what we're doing for them. We do a deep dive into the deck that give you a better understanding of what the deck is. But for people who are just joining and want a brief overview, we'll give that as well. So Ott's deck here is the first one that we're going to go over. Ott, Open Door. This is a mid-range deck. It's green. It's one of the few good green decks in the meta. You're able to sort of use it like an acceleration panel, and because of World's Reverse, which is an incredible piece. You can basically choose what your deck's doing at any point in time. If you want to play more tempo, if you want to play more aggro, if you want to play more controlling, you have the ability to more mid-range, I should say. You have the ability to escalate your deck into those types of things. Nothing has changed entirely about the deck. Like nothing ground-shattering has happened to the deck, but we have made a few changes. First among them, we've added Aya into it. This has got the ability where you can down it and pull something from your enter zone and put it into your field. Because you have a lot of enter in here, this is basically just draw, which is really nice. More importantly, it's a Wartone Amuser, which means that it works with this class setup that Ott has to play around in order to be good. The other one that we've added is to Fatisi, Memoria Azure, which is a level 1, but it gives Shadow. Well, actually, sorry, we've added 3 of them. It gives Shadow to itself from level Signy 2 or lower on the opponent's turn. It's got a really good life burst in making the opponent discard cards, and then you can enable an attack, disable an attack from an Elrig or a Signy. It's just plays really well into the defense of this deck is really tied into its life bursts. Like you're very dependent on the life bursts defending you. And this is a very good life burst to defend it. Now, we don't have any discard in this deck to force the issue of the opponent being low on cards. If you wanted to swap out Umir down to Umir Clear, you could have more of that, but that would also lower your defense. Umir down is one of the better defenders that you can be playing. It also adds the fact that it's a beauty, right? So you've got another beauty in here, which is the Mirai. So between Mirai and this, you've got a lot of beauties, and you have a fair amount of labyrinths as well. So you're going to want to go ahead and make sure that while you're playing this deck, you're paying a little bit more attention to the classes that you're using. You definitely will want to use your beauty classes just as soon as possible, being that they're the only thing in this that is 7, that you have 7 copies of. The rest are all 4 or 3 or 2 copies of things. So definitely the order for when you're spending your enter should be that. Overall, the deck has gotten a little stronger, finally, in this set, because Anaya gives a little bit more of this this consistency that you've been looking for. And Fatase gives you a little bit more of defensive positioning you've also been looking for. Let me load a new deck into here. Let's go into Atomic Deus. We're just going to go in alphabetical order here. Atomic Deus didn't get really anything worth mentioning. I'm looking over here to see if I've changed literally anything. Oh, I got one thing that's really worth mentioning, but the rest is probably pretty standard. This is a lot like what you saw in the deck that got top 8 for some of the decks, like the blue-black decks that got top eight in the last ceremony. So nothing's really changed about this build. It still does what it wants to do, which is it's a tribal synergy, rip cards out of your opponent's hand, have the best removal in the game, because it really does have the best lane openers in the game, period. Plus it gets to use one of the best Signy in the game, H2O, which is just an incredibly defensive positioning Signy while simultaneously being very good offensively for you. The one thing that it got, I think, that sets it apart now is Garden of Singularity. Now, Garden of Singularity is worse than Machina Guardian Dragon, in my opinion, in a vacuum. However, one of the ways that Atomic Deus lost, and probably the only reason when I look back at my run at the ceremony, I lost and didn't go 7-0, was because the games that I lost, I didn't have a guard on turn 1 or turn 2. And this fixes that. It makes things a lot tighter, right? You get to draw a card, and then you get the following ability. You may discard 3 cards from your hand instead of discarding a card with guard to guard. I just needed consistency in my early guard turns, and so this ends up being one of those things. And then when you get to late game, when the opponent and you are both out of ways to mass discard each other, and you just sort of have things on field and you're jockeying for position, this can also help you get to that very, very late game. So it's weird that it's really good turn, like, 2 and turn, like, 1, maybe. It's a little arguable if it's good on turn 1, but you could do it on turn 1, it would be pretty okay. And then later down in the game, right, it becomes very good again. So turn 6 and 7, it becomes really good again. But it's not so great in those in-between turns. But I really just needed to patch up my guards in those early turns. So I think this is what the future of what Atomic Deus is going to want to end up doing, because it is actually pretty aggressive, and it does want those early guards. Moving right along, let's see here, load the deck. Card Jockey. So I think the death of Card Jockey has been a little overstated. I actually think Card Jockey is still incredibly good in this meta, and actually has gotten quite a few upgrades from this set. And the reason is because there's just not a lot of people running Machina Guardian Dragon, and with people not really running Machina Guardian Dragon, Card Jockey still ends up being pretty okay. There are some ways to negate Elrig's attacks now outside of Machina Guardian Dragon, which is worth mentioning. So I think the deck is now no longer an A-tiered deck. I put it down as a B-tiered deck. But I still think it will pull up results. There's just not, like, we would really need to see a big wave of Card Jockey to make us all want to play Machina Guardian Dragon in our deck. And then when that happens, it will drop down. But it's pretty fantastic. Kirakirum hasn't shown up in any numbers, so there's really no way to there's nothing shutting down the Endless Punchline on that end of the world. So I think this is still very, very, very good. For those people who don't know how this deck functions, you have a very weird deck setup in the fact that you're skewed heavily towards 3s and spells, so that way you can use Endless Punchline. Once Endless Punchline goes off, you're able to attack for 3 damage, and sort of has this combo flourish finish. And it is quite strong, and that can force a lot of damage very quickly with it. You can even end games on turn 3. The updates to this is that we added some Yukis, which just are aggressive. Like, it's weird to think of it as aggressive, but it is, right? So you're able to swap a Signy out of one zone into another zone. That's good for stopping those center Signy zone effects. And also you can make an Signy lose all of its abilities till end of turn. This is pretty good when you are running uh, a way to basically kill 13Ks, H2Os. You need to get them out of the way for you to deal damage. This is where this card really shines. But this is where this card shines the most in any deck that I've actually created. I like this card quite a bit, but because this deck has such a high number of life bursts that allow you to put it out from your deck into play and fill a lane, you end up being able to do things like playing this out against X and you can stop a lane of attack and turn off Assassin, or put this out against H2O and it stops its ability to draw cards. And if you manage to kill it with one of your Elrigs or something, it will leave the field right away. So it does actually a lot of stopping things on the opponent's turn that make it really annoying, to the point where I was kind of considering the fact that maybe this should be a 3-3 split between the Zhao Yun or the Yuki. I can't decide whether or not that's accurate, but I think it's a pretty good idea to maybe do a 3-3 split, maybe even a 4-2. It really depends on your preference. I don't know where the meta is exactly yet, so that's going to be something as a card jockey player I think I would want to watch personally. The last thing that you're adding is Remember. Between Remember and also your PJ map, PRJ map, you are able to tax the guarding of your opponents to it's too much. They're not going to be able to deal with it. It's just going to be a constant tax on them. So this helps push the deck into more of an aggressive territory. Not to mention, like I said, it's a 13. It's going to be a 15 powered Signy. I keep thinking it's 13 for some reason. It's 15 powered. It's going to be 15 powered, and also it's going to be able to tax their actions, aka mostly souls. So that's pretty good as well. You're not really going to be taxing them and it being super effective, but draining the resources in general is just a pretty good thing to do. And outside of that, it's pretty much the card jockey deck that you know. Just keep pushing in damage. Moving right along here, let's load another deck in. Cosmos. So I still have Lion Alt 3 as the Cosmos Signy, or Cosmos Elrig right now. I think next set that will end up being Musica, but for now, it's right now, I think it's still correct to be using Lion. This is wrong here. This is the wrong Alifard. Ignore that. It's just a copy-paste error. So the Alifard draws you a card. It's level 1 that draws you a card. Cool. That moving on. It still does everything that a Cosmos deck does, which is basically really, really use Paradise Universe to create open lanes, to create it so that an effect that everything in your deck is a level 1 Signy, so everything goes off, and you're using that to basically have consistent lane openers all the time. Pretty much everything in the deck is going to be able to open up lanes, and I think that's the correct way to function with the deck. The only slight change that I've done is I've added Yuki here as well as a 2-of. It's not super, super important. You can replace this with Ramel or something else. I just think the deck needed a little bit more white to function. And so Yuki, I thought, was the most powerful level 1 white card that I could be playing. So I added that to the deck. I think there's also a level 1 that's getting made in this deck now that allows you to filter for different Cosmos Signy. You can discard a Cosmos Signy from your hand, look at the top 5, grab a Cosmos Signy, and put it into your hand. I ended up not going with that because I just was like, there's already so much Cosmos. I don't and they all do the same thing. They all open up lanes, that I didn't prefer one over another. There was no real reason for me to be doing that. The only other card that I added in here is this one, Microscopium, Natural Planet. It's a level 2, 5,000 power. Enter ability is look at the top, put the top card of your deck into the trash. If it's a level 1 Signy, then you can pay 1. If you do, target level 1 Signy on your opponent's field to get, or target a Signy on your opponent's field and it gets negative 5,000 power till end of turn. So again, it's just more removal, right? Everything's just more removal in this deck. So it's all removal. Um, I think it's just a little bit more consistent. I don't think it's any better, being the fact that it has struggles against decks that give aggro decks struggling with anything anyways. So I don't think it's majorly upgraded, but I think it's been minorly upgraded. Um, moving right along over into, let's do Deus DXM. So DXM decks in general, both the X version that we're going to be talking about in a second, as well as the Deus version, are just really, really, really aggressive decks. Uh, Deus runs more of a hyper aggro suite with the ability to bring back some stuff from its trash to silver bullet its aggro game plans a little bit more, whereas the X deck focuses more on Enterburn, right? Those are the two differences between the deck. One of the problems with Deus aggro that is now solved is the fact that it had a trouble. It really wanted to run like 20 red cards and 20 black cards, maybe even sometimes 16 black cards and 24 red cards, which is crazy, but is what it wanted to do because it wanted to be very, very aggressive. There's a solve in that now, and that solve is Tama. The new black Tama is attacks as a 13k. It can have shadow 2 or less if you have 10 or more cards in your trash, which you will have 10 or more cards in your trash with this deck. And also, if any of your cards that are black, which is everything when Tama's basically out, is targeted, you can mill your opponent for 2, which is actually very, very good. This solves the problem with that. Now all of the red cards in your enter are black when you use this, so you end up being able to be a little bit more greedy with your enter than you normally would. And it's worth mentioning that we're leaning into the silver bullet ability of Deus being able to recover cards from our trash and put them to our hand. We have Buffalo in here, we have Tengu in here, and we have Layla Rue, how to pronounce it. These basically combo together in order to create it so that if we were playing against Madoka down or Madoka clap, you can't have your Tengu downed, which means that you'll be able to attack through to the opponent and do damage to them. All it requires you to do is bring back one Buffalo and both Tengus, and then you'll be able to basically buff both Tengus into the amount that they need to be in order to not be downed by Madoka Clap, and that'll let you really push damage. The other one is if you're playing against a MC Line Disrespect, you can play this instead. This is a level 2 Rise Signy, and it needs to rise on top of a level 1. That's its main goal. It is 12,000 power, though, which means it is very buff for a level 2, and it has a constant ability, which is this target the Signy can't gain new abilities by your opponent's card effects. That's really going to be most relevant for the Signy can't attack. That's an effect that you're giving, so therefore it can't attack. So it'll attack straight through and be very happily to attack straight through. It also has an auto ability. When the Signy attacks, you can discard one card from your hand. If you do, draw one card. That helps with Deus's wanting to use the trash with Trigger Victory and stuff like that. It's got a life burst where you can target one of your opponent's Signy with power 12,000 or less and vanish it if you discard a card. Again, not a super hard thing for us to do, so that is something that we will end up doing. Overall, this is what the deck looks like now. I think it's still smashing pretty hard and doing DXM justice. I just think it's now on equal footing, maybe, or maybe a little less equal footing than X itself. Speaking of X, let's talk about it. So again, the difference between X and the normal DXM is this is more of an all-in black or all-in red deck. Focuses a bit more on Enter Burn and also has access to Assassin. So it's just a bit more, it's weirdly a little less aggressive than the other one. It's less hyper aggressive. It's still an aggro deck for sure. But it finishes the game mostly on turn 4 and 5 rather than the other deck, which finishes the game mostly on turn 3 and 4. So what we added to this deck is we did add one Tama. This allows us to have a little bit more power in terms of our enter. We always struggled a little bit with this, where we want to play the 4 X-Sax in order to have black in our deck. But then the other 4 black cards, or the other 2 black cards, is questionable, right? What do you want it to be? And sometimes it's an Mirage, sometimes it's Steampunk, sometimes it's an Arash. I think Tama is the right choice here. Tama does what Arash does, but just slightly better. Vanish target level 1, or target level 2 or less on the opponent's field and vanish it. I think that's just worth having as a life burst in general in this type of deck. Plus the 13k power is not bad, and then having access to being able to pay for your blacks pretty easily can help you. There are times where you have no black enter and you need to pull off Kentoki's ability, and putting out a Tama will just then make that a possibility. And the cool thing is you can actually play the Tama, use the black for your Kentoki, and then you can sacrifice the Tama if you need to use something else. I think it's quite strong here. The other card that we're going to be playing now as a 3 of is this Tristan. So every color got access to the ability to have this life burst, which is look at the top 5 cards of your deck, add 3 of them to your hand, and then put the bottom the rest of them. I think red and green probably appreciate this more than the other colors do. But this deck severely died to a lot of hand disruption, and this life burst does a lot to combat that. I think inevitably you'll be down to like, oh no, I'm at 0 cards, and then you'll hit a Tristan, you'll be like, I'm back in the game, and basically the discard opponent has wasted all their turns prior to this to try to get them to be down to no cards. You got to remember, you can fight back a little bit with Deus Recovery if you wanted to go with that option, as well as Machina Shield, Machina Wing Slash, allowing you to bring back a bunch of cards. Also, Death Deck allows you to bring back cards, and so does Trigger a Victory. So it's good to have some way to combat the discard deck. I think adding a couple Tristans, 3 seems to be the magic number for me, will help you do that. Let's talk about No Limit, which again, I've downgraded to a B-tiered deck, but there's not really a ton of Machina Guardian Dragons stopping me from wanting to use Glory Grow. The cool thing is there's Entwined Ascendancy, so you could actually take out Glory Grow, put Entwined Ascendancy in there, and it basically functions the same. Or you could double down, and you could take out Go to the Top and put in Entwined Ascendancy and Glory Grow, and you end up with these really strong damage push turns for a hyper aggro deck, and that's what this deck is, hyper aggressive. And I think it still functions the same way that you normally function Hirana. The Elrig deck is still very solid. Minimal amount of defense that disrupts your opponent, while simultaneously constantly refilling your hand. So even if the opponent is a discard deck, it does not affect you. You also get to discard your opponents out with the Raise, which inevitably puts people in binds, makes them discard guards. As well as Go to the Top at the top end to really blow out one of their turns in terms of enter, and maybe you can squeak a win with denying them the ability to grow their assist Elrigs. Outside of that, it hasn't changed a ton. You're gonna not really see any new cards on this list. You will see Remember, which again is just, we're playing white. Why not, right? This deck was playing Arcwayne prior, and this is just kind of an upgrade on Arcwayne on all fronts. You're doing enough enter deprival that, or enter denying that, or enter burning, excuse me, that the ability is pretty relevant. It's going to tax them to guard, and they're really going to be, they're going to be hard pressed to pay for that with us being red burn as well. And then outside of that, it's just a very strong attacker, which is something that the deck likes. And I mean, yeah, it can jockey for position a little bit defensively, being that it'll be a 15k on the defensive stuff. But I think that this is neutral. I think you're mostly using it to have taxed guards. Again, we see Tristan here. I don't think Tristan's as needed when you have 2 Rays. But it could be used, so I have it here. If you wanted to swap these out for something like more Remembers, I really wouldn't say no to that kind of a thing. This is sort of where I think it's at. Again, it wins games. Machina Guardian Dragon on its own pops it down to a B-tiered deck now, but it's still winning games very strong. I think it's underrepresented in the current meta. I think you can still definitely take down tournaments with this type of deck. Let's go into Hirana midrange. Hirana midrange is the one that I think suffered the most from this last set, and the reason is mostly because of the existence of Tama as being an A tier deck, and also the existence of Tamago, right? Existence of that kind of pressures this and makes you think, well, why am I running this when I could be running Tamago? And they do similar stuff, but I think Tamago might do it a little, like, do the same sort of mid-range control element a little bit better. The other thing that this had going for it that Tamago didn't have going for it was it had still a pretty good clock that the Tamago deck doesn't necessarily have. And that position is now challenged by Tama. Tama midrange is able to function in a way that it's still able to put up just the same amount of clock that this Hirana midrange deck is, but it is also a little more versatile in the fact that it has better lane openers, in my opinion, as well as more things going for it in terms of like, oh, I can't clear the field. I need to go a little bit longer game. That's fine. My Tama can now attack. So it bumped down a little bit in terms of my pecking order. But it still gets a few upgrades. Most notably upgrade that it gets is it gets Tama. And yeah, I know I said Tama twice. I was talking about Tama the Elrig and Tama the Black Signy. I think it gets Tama the Black Signy, which is very strong in the fact that it allows it to it allows you to be greedy with your enter. And this deck has always been very greedy with its enters. It's one of the things I haven't loved about it, but I think this is the way to sort of fix that a little bit. So I've got 2 in here. I think 3 is maybe more correct. I have the Deafening Inferno because I wanted a little bit more red, and I also wanted a little bit more lane openings. But you probably could swap that to a Tama and feel fine with it. Maybe swap out the Caesar then for something else in that level 2 slot. But yeah, Hirana midrange, it's still a viable deck. It's basically, if I didn't explain this earlier, it's basically just a deck that is going to be good stuff. It will always push on the opponent's, it always push damage out there pretty regularly on a very, very good clock while simultaneously having a defensive thing. It's your bog average sword and shield type of playstyle. All right, let's see what else we've got here. You're on mid-range. Mono white. So there's a mono white Tama build, and I think that's perfectly doable as well. I think Akino gives the deck a slightly different profile that is still worth mentioning. I do not know which is better, or if Tama pushes one mono white out of the tier list, while this one is better. They're both basically the same deck. The only difference is with mono white, again, your idea is you're pretty much an aggro deck. Instead of vanishing stuff, you're enter depriving by bouncing things to their hand, which means you'll see them later, and it's less good against decks that have lots of enter effects, like, for example, the Ott deck with World's Reverse. But the upside is that you can get rid of basically anything, so you're always going for good attacks. Akino and Tama is a good question. Which one do you want to run as your center? Otherwise, it's basically the same deck. You can swap either of those, and it's the same deck. I don't know where it is yet. I haven't done enough testing. Akino still gives the ability to give your stuff shadow, which I like because it also has consistent lane opening in its ability. There's not so much Exia that I'm scared that Akino just immediately triggers Exia, which would be annoying. So I think Akino might still be better than Tama, which feels a little sacrilegious to say. But I think it's pretty good. I like the idea that you can still draw a card and enter charge. I like it's bog standard, and it also lets you get the shadow turn, which I think can really help buy you some space to get an extra attack, and another turn to get an extra attack. And again, this Alifard should be the level 1 Alifard that draws a card when it attacks. It's like it's the least relevant card in this, and could be probably replaced with anything and perfectly fine. One of the new cards that we're going to be playing is the Osiris. So Osiris only works in basically mono white decks, and even there you only want to really use it as a 2 of. It's got the ability of, it's a level 3 white Signy with the ability of, at the beginning of your attack phase, you may pay white. If you do, target one of the Signies on your opponent's field with a level lower than, equal or lower than the amount of white Elrigs you have on the field and return to their hand. So if you're running at least 2, you'll always be able to hit a level 2. But if you have a 3, yeah, cool, you can hit 3s and below, which is pretty cool. It has the action ability of white. This Signy gains constant. This Signy gains shadow during your opponent's turn until the next turn. So it gives a little bit of defensive jockeying. That is pretty okay, but it's not like utterly amazing. Paying for your shadow is sad. But you can do it if you were like, yeah, this is the turn that the opponent's going to need to white heaven me, or this is the turn that the opponent's going to need to souls through this. You can pay for it. Otherwise, you might not pay for it. It has an action ability from your trash. You can exclude it from the game, and then target one Signy with a guard from your trash and add it to your hand. It costs a ton, so you probably won't ever do it, but it's better than not having the option there, is what I always say. So it's something that could be there, which would be kind of cool. We've got Yuki here as well. Again, this is an aggressive Yuki. You're going to be using this to basically turn remembers from a level, or from a 15k to a 12k, and then kill it with things. You might also turn off H2Os, and then you'll be able to bounce them with your White Heaven, or kill them with your Burning Curiosity, bounce them with your Ange. The other change is going to be for this I don't know how to pronounce this one. Kolia. This is actually way better than I want to give it credit for. I always read this card and I'm always like, yeah, I don't think it's that great. But it actually is pretty good. It's a level 3 white Signy. At the beginning of your attack phase, if there are the same number of cards in your life cloth as the opponent's life cloth, you get to draw a 1 card. That happens more often than you think. It's not something you track very often, but it happens more often than you'd think. It's better in decks that are sort of these like defensive decks that really only deal 1 or 2 damage a turn to the opponent, because they're also limiting the opponent to only dealing 1 or 2 damage a turn to them. So it ends up being pretty par for the course. It also has an ability of auto once during your turn. When the Signy on your opponent's field attacks, you can target 1 Signy on your opponent's field, and it loses all of the abilities till end of turn. Again, this is a pretty good one to put out with your Akino, and then when your Akino shadow it up, so that way you can then strip things like Lancer or strip things like Assassin from your opponent's Signy, or just strip relevant abilities from your opponent's Signy as well. So I like that a lot. And the decks that struggle with lane opening, this will just be a thorn in their side the whole time. And then you've got the enter ability of white. Look at the top 3 cards of your deck, add up to 1 from among them to your hand, and then put them on the rest in the bottom in any order. It's got the life burst of target upped Signy on your opponent's field and put it in the trash. Trash is a more powerful place to put it than back in their hand. So it draws a lot of parallels to Arcwin, and I think this gets the nudge over Arcwin in terms of power. Sometimes you'll want the shadow. Rarely you'll want the shadow. I don't think it's super great to have the shadow right now, at least in this current meta, so I think it's okay there. And then the last of the new cards that we're adding is the Remember Memoria. Again, I can't stress it enough. This card's just awesome. 15k attacker that taxes guards and taxes actions is just fantastic. So you'll always want to play 4 of these in these mono white aggro decks. Because of that, we've lowered the amount of Exia, because Exia's kind of got a nobo with Remember. Remember wants to be downed in order to be 15. Exia ups it, so it is no longer 15k, and then it can die pretty easily. So yeah, I lowered the amount of Exias. Exias were kind of one of those weird things in mono white aggro where it worked and it took your opponent by surprise, and you put fields up that were annoying. But it was never it never helped the deck achieve the goals it was trying to achieve. Remember does that, so that's why that split ends up happening there instead. Let's talk about Musica for a second. I thought I said Musica, but I guess I don't have Musica here. That's fine. I can quickly grab it and put it into play here. So let me just go ahead and do that. We're doing it live, guys. We're doing it live. I like Musica still. I think Musica is still a valid deck that you want to be potentially playing. And I actually think it has quite a lot going for it. I was playing it yesterday, and I was surprised by how powerful it actually is. I think everything here is correct. If I have to change anything, oh yeah, I do. This Tama. And we're using just, well, I can use this to plug Tetris's Cockatrice app. So we're using Cockatrice here. And it's a really great way to deck build or theory craft prior to the decks coming out. So Musica is very good in the fact that it bounces one of your like the whole goal of it, right, is that it's versatile in the fact that it can bounce one of your basically level 2 main phase main phase attack or main phase assist Elrics, and it gets you double access to it. The trick that we do with this one is that with X Step Out, you basically have a free level 2 that gives Assassin to things, and Enter charges you 2 or draws you 2. So at the end of the day, you end up with something like 4 extra cards in hand, and you also end up with 2 Assassins for very cheap, or you end up with like 2 more Enter, or even 6 more. I've done it against Enter burn decks and just done the gotten 4 extra Enter, so I can MC line Disrespect immediately, and it ends up being very, very, very powerful in that front. The trick with it is it really powers up Coco more than you'd expect. Coco turning the step out into 0 means that you get like a net gain of almost 4 Enter when you're using step out. So it's very, very strong. That's the trick between this deck. It's a little bit of a aggro or mid-range combo deck in that front. The new cards that it gets that are definitely worth mentioning is Miasma Labyrinth. I'm going to read this one out fully. I think it might be on a couple other decks. But you'll see this card quite often. It's got main phase timing. It's use conditions that you got to have a Dream Team, and you have to have 3 colors. And then the ability is you can basically choose 3 if your Elrig is level 3, which is basically when you're going to be using it. It'll allow you to give an opponent's Signy negative 12,000. Allow you to bring a card Signy from your trash to your hand, and that could include guards. It allows you to take a Signy from your trash and put it into the field, or it can also have each player mill the top 7 cards of their deck. Generally speaking, I think you should be probably using the kill something, bring a guard back, and mill options more often than not. But if you need to push damage, you could use the kill option, the bring a guard back, and the bring a card back from the trash to the field, and that card will probably be some form of removal spell. The deck's that card is just fantastic and lets you basically always win the late games. Other than that, the deck is not really running very much new cards. It is running a Tama, and this Tama, again, is a 13k, has Shadow, and has a very, very relevant Life Burst. It also allows you to be a little bit more flexible in your Enter costs. This is a bit of an Enter greedy deck. It has quite a bit of reds in it just because the red cards are good, and it has quite a bit of white cards in it because you need to turn on MC Line Disrespect. So Tama just being an all-arounder here to allow you to basically cheat on black costs a little bit, go a little bit lighter on black, is really needed in this Musica deck. Otherwise, it's a very, very good deck, and I think it's still very, very solid. The Madoka deck here, which I must have saved over, has changed a little bit as well. A lot of the times you'll see Madoka being white, blue, blue, and they're doing stuff like trying to do some Enter deprival, as well as trying to open up lanes with Summer Lives blues. I don't think it's doable in the Madoka deck. I think you need more lane openers in Madoka than you do in these other blue tempo decks, because you so efficiently strip their hand starting from turn 3 onwards that you really, really, really you don't care that you're tossing cards back in their hand at that point. There was a game I was playing yesterday where my opponent used Madoka, bounced like 4 cards back into my hand, and then I started the turn, or I ended the turn when she attacked with the Madoka with no cards in hand. Um, and it's just like, that's what this deck can do, you know? So I think what it really struggles with is timing, pacing. Like, it needs to beat the opponent in terms of opening lanes, and it struggled with that a bit, which is why we end up more now with a white version, with using this Ange to really help push the damage output of the deck. Other than that, it's really running bog standard. Nothing's really changed in it, aside from I did actually add some trouble because it wanted a little bit more defensive Elrig advantage. And I also added the Yuki here. Yuki is just always really good when you're running Ange and White Heaven, because then you can turn off things like H2O, and you can bounce that back to their hand then after that. So I like Yuki in these types of decks, even though it's pretty aggressive. Otherwise, this is pretty bog standard. I have found that it does just the right amount of discard, just does the amount of the lane openers for it to be a very consistent deck. So nothing's really changed from Madoka. That's probably a good thing for those people who really like Madoka, because it means that they can use it more often. And I don't think things will change too much more. I think it'll just get slow but sure upgrades. So it's a good deck to invest into if you like that type of gameplay. This is the Nova deck that our local Anthony pilots. He basically got 6th place in the last ceremony with it. He's a crazy deck builder. I absolutely love his brews. I took his brew and just sort of like changed it ever so slightly. So the deck is still really the same. If you guys want to see a really in-depth explanation on how to run Nova, then watch the podcast where I interview him. He goes into great detail about it, and I gotta say, this is a really difficult deck to pilot, so you'll want to listen to that if you want to do that. But it is more like a mid-range controlling deck where it's almost like stacks. You're forcing your opponent into a bunch of catch-22s, looping a lot of Fenrir's and things like that while discarding them. So if you like that style of gameplay, you might want to consider Nova. I didn't add a ton to Nova to make it quote-unquote much better, but I did add a few. The first thing I did was add Aya, just because I think the deck could use a little bit more consistency, pulling things out from its enter zone instead of just the trash. The deck really functions on looping things, so I think Aya helps just make those loops a little easier to achieve, while simultaneously hitting 6 green, which is sort of the number you need to hit in order to hit with Bang de Capo. Outside of that, I lowered the amount of Exia to 3 instead of 4. I think it was 4 in the one prior, so 3 is not a huge amount, and I only have 2 remembers in here. I asked him before I tweaked his list, hey, how much remembers should I be running over Exias? Because a 4-4 split is a little difficult to work because they're sort of nobos together, and he said he liked Exia in this deck in particular better than Remember, so I trust him, and I think that's probably the right way to go then. So that's the Nova deck. Not a ton has changed from it. Moving forward, trying to go at the speed of light here. Let's go with Tamago. So Tamago is not changed a ton either. I really respect what the other Tamago decks did. I like their version better than what I was repping. I still don't think Bradamante is the greatest card known to man, and I actually think that's supported by the last ceremony that we did. The decks that had less Bradamantes did better. But still, some amount of Bradamantes is, I think, correct. I think you can go lower on the number because of Machina Smash and Machina Wing Slash than you normally would. And so that's sort of a change on what I've done to the decks particularly. Nothing really has changed all that much in terms of new cards. I have made one change, which is I've added Futuse to it. I think, generally speaking, you are the discard deck. You'll have more cards in your hand than the opponent, so this will end up having Shadow level 2 or less more often, and I really chose it because of its life burst. Its life burst being that you can target an L-Rig with it and disable the attack unless the opponent discards 3 cards from their hand. In the discard deck where you're pushing pressure on their hand anyways, that allows you to save yourself a damage. And so I kind of weirdly consider this Folklore number 5, or number 5, 6, and 7, even though it's not exactly that, because Folklore will always, generally speaking, will always save you at least 1 damage, and in rare cases save you 2 damage, which is amazing. This will save you damage when all 3 of the Signies have attacked. They hit this as their 3rd attack, it connects, and you're able to do it on an L-Rig, which is pretty rare. It's one of the main reasons why I really, really like this card. Even if it doesn't have Shadow, just in the Life Burst slot, it ends up being quite amazing. So that's it with this deck. Otherwise, it is just your bog standard and probably best version of your mid-range control. It's probably more control. Discard deck where you're discarding the opponent, limiting their options, and then the late game you start opening up lanes and providing a clock. I still think it's very, very, very strong. I definitely would use it. Moving forward, it still seems incredibly strong with Tamago's ability to randomly discard and then just freeze things that while you're discarding, so you don't always have to open up lanes. You can just sit there and let them exhaust themselves out. The last deck that I'm going to go over, just because it's in chronological order or alphabetical order, is Umir. So Umir deck is still what Tiffany's running. She keeps wrecking with this, which leads me to believe this Umir deck is a lot stronger than people are giving credit for. They're just not playing it. But this Umir deck keeps just wiping tournaments. The last loot card tournament that Tiffany was in, she did get first place with it. And it is weirdly strong. The changes since the last time I've talked about this Umir deck, which was the last set, was we took out the Clepsydras just because they weren't super great and replaced them with Hakats, which are super great. And we changed our L-Rig setup to being a very weird one. Now, you might see Anj level 2 here and say, yeah, that's just the aggressive Anj that we normally know, and the answer is absolutely it is. But we don't normally run this Anj, which is the pay 1 target opponent's Signy goes into the trash, right? And the reason was we really found the secret sauce to turning on Hastelik's effect was to deprive the opponent of enter end cards in hand, which is difficult because white, generally speaking, bounces cards to hands. So rather than using a bounce, having this be a trash, even though, yes, it costs an enter for us and that stinks, really, really made Umir start playing very, very well. It started making that engine hum. And outside of that, the deck is pretty much the same as it was prior. There is 2 differences that are things that, again, I've repeated over and over again. We've got Yuki. This is the wrong Yuki, clearly. The Yuki that should be here is the level 1 Yuki. Here, I bet you we can pull it up here. This Yuki, which allows you to turn off effects. So this is really good against specifically H2O, which the deck struggled with a bit. Turning off H2O's ability and then bouncing it is really, really fantastic. And then also lane switching is actually pretty okay in this deck because you might need to lane switch something over into the Hamlin area in order to get your best effects off of it. So the deck actually does play loose and fast with positioning. Sometimes it swaps up the Hamlin's positioning, for example. So it likes being able to take stuff and tossing it out of the center's lane. So this is the deck where that actually pops up the most. But also just turning off things on the opponent's field is really good. And again, we've got Remember. Remember is actually obscenely strong in this deck. Literally every single mode on Remember is powerful in this type of deck. The ability to be a 15k blocker is huge. The ability to be a 15k attacker is huge. Taxing in this deck, when you say, hey, you can't guard unless you pay 1, the opponent basically never has enter in this deck. So it ends up being the opponent can't guard. This is so strong to be playing in the deck, as well as taxing their souls. You often will they will be able to pay for the souls in their turn, but they'll be choosing to pay for the souls and then not being able to pay for the Hastilic effect later down the line on your turn. So it's sort of a give and take. Often this deck already often stops them from being able to play full powerful claps and disrespects, because you're draining their cards in their hand and you're draining the cards in their their enter. So taxing just ever so slightly more, and it's very relevant tax, ends up being very, very, very strong for this deck. So this is a pretty good deck to end on, I think. This is the Umir Death and Taxes deck. It's incredible. It's much, much, much more powerful with the addition of Remember and Yuki. Actually, were sort of like two pieces of the puzzle that were missing. So I highly suggest you guys try it out if you want some of this like blue-white tempo decks. Going over it, I just want to make sure that I hit every single thing. I hit the Nova Umir No Limit. Yep. I'm just looking at my list to make sure I've got literally all of the things that we did. Atomic Deus, cool, we did that as well. Madoka, Tamago 2, cool, we did everything. I did have a build that was a diagram atomic build, and I think if you wanted to play diagram, you could play basically the same atomic build that you'd be playing with the Atomic Deus, but I don't think we're quite at the point where I think other atomic builds are better than Deus. I think the only one that maybe gives it a run for its money is Madoka. I think you could take the Madoka center and then just apply the exact, literally copy paste the Deus rest of the deck into it, and you'd end up with a pretty good deck to use. So I think that is also an option. Yeah, those are all the current meta decks, in my opinion, the best of the rest that you could be playing in Wixoss right now. If you guys have any ideas, thought I skipped anything that you wanted to see, or have any questions about any of these that I can answer in more detail, since I did mostly gloss over a lot of details just to get into the changes of these decks, comment down the comments down below. I'm sure me or one of the other commenters can help talk about what is good in these decks, especially if it's one of their main decks that they run.